The morning sun rose slowly over Fairbrook, painting the small town in shades of gold and amber. Julia Scott stepped out of her modest cottage on Maple Street, breathing in the crisp autumn air. At 67, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to appreciate each moment, each breath, each ordinary day. She locked her door and began her usual walk to the town center. Fairbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where shops still had bells above their doors, and where the biggest news was usually about whose pumpkin won first prize at the Harvest Festival. Julia liked it that way. "Morning, Julia," called Mrs. Henderson from her porch across the street. The elderly woman was watering her geraniums, her white hair pinned back in its customary bun. "Good morning, Martha," Julia replied with a warm smile. "Those flowers are looking beautiful." "Oh, they're nothing special," Martha said, but her face glowed with pride. "Will I see you at book club on Thursday?" "Wouldn't miss it," Julia assured her. She continued down Maple Street, passing the neat rows of houses with their well-kept lawns and white picket fences. Children were heading to school, backpacks bouncing on their shoulders. Dogs barked friendly greetings from behind gates. It was all wonderfully, peacefully ordinary. At the corner of Main Street, Julia stopped at Rosie's Diner, just as she had every weekday morning for the past 22 years. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the warm scent of coffee and fresh pastries embraced her. "There she is," Rosie called from behind the counter. Rosie Martinez had owned the diner for 30 years, and her smile could light up the darkest day. "Your usual table is waiting, honey." Julia slid into the booth by the window, her favorite spot. From here, she could watch the town wake up. Mr. Peterson opening his hardware store across the street. Young Sarah Chen jogging past with her golden retriever. The mailman beginning his rounds. "One coffee, black, and a blueberry muffin," Rosie said, setting down Julia's breakfast without asking. "You're as predictable as sunrise, Julia Scott." "Predictable is underrated," Julia said softly, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Amen to that," Rosie agreed. "Though you've got to admit, sometimes a little excitement wouldn't hurt. This town could put an insomniac to sleep." Julia's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've had enough excitement for one lifetime, Rosie." Rosie squeezed her shoulder affectionately. "I know, honey, I know." But Rosie didn't know. Nobody in Fairbrook knew. And that was exactly how Julia wanted it. After finishing her coffee, Julia walked the remaining 3 blocks to the Fairbrook Municipal Building. It was a modest structure of red brick, built in 1952, with white columns that were meant to look impressive, but mostly just looked tired. This was where Julia worked. She entered through the side entrance, nodding to Gary, the security guard who spent most of his shift reading mystery novels. "Morning, Ms. Scott," he said, barely looking up from his book. "Morning, Gary." In the basement, Julia found her supply cart already prepared. Mops, cleaning solutions, fresh trash bags, paper towels, the tools of her trade for the past 2 decades. She put on her blue cleaning uniform and began her rounds. Most people didn't see cleaning staff. They were invisible, part of the background, like the furniture or the fluorescent lights. Julia had learned this long ago. She could move through the building like a ghost, unnoticed and unremarked upon. It was perfect. She started on the first floor, in the public areas. The lobby with its worn linoleum and outdated portraits of past mayors. The public restrooms that always needed attention. The small cafe where employees grabbed their morning coffee. "Oh, Julia, thank goodness," said Amanda from the Parks Department, rushing past with an armful of files. "Could you do the conference room on 2? We've got a big meeting this afternoon." "Of course," Julia said quietly. "You're the best," Amanda called over her shoulder, already hurrying away. Julia pushed her cart toward the elevators. She had a system, a routine perfected over years. First floor public spaces in the morning, second floor offices before lunch, third floor, which included the mayor's office and the council chambers, in the afternoon. The basement archives and storage rooms before she left for the day. The work was simple, repetitive, and undemanding. She cleaned toilets, emptied trash bins, mopped floors, wiped down desks. It required no creativity, no thought, no emotional investment. It was exactly what she needed. By noon, Julia had finished the second floor. She ate her packed lunch in the small break room in the basement, a tuna sandwich and an apple, the same meal she brought every day. A few other employees came and went, offering friendly nods but mostly leaving her alone. She was part of the furniture. At 1 o'clock, she took the elevator to the third floor, the executive level, as some people jokingly called it. This was where Mayor Howard Pierce had his office, along with the city council members and the town administrator. Julia had cleaned these offices for 22 years. She had seen 5 different mayors come and go, though Pierce had been in office for the past 10 years. She had watched young council members grow older, seen administrations change, witnessed the small dramas of small-town politics. But she had never been involved. She cleaned and left. That was her job. That was her life. Mayor Pierce's office was at the end of the hall, a corner room with large windows overlooking the town square. The mayor himself was rarely there in the early afternoon. He usually spent his time at lunch meetings or ribbon-cutting ceremonies, or whatever it was that small-town mayors did. Julia unlocked the door with her master key and wheeled her cart inside. The office was larger than most in the building, with dark wood furniture that was meant to convey importance. There was a massive desk covered with papers and files, leather chairs, a bookshelf lined with law books that looked like they had never been opened, and several photographs of Pierce shaking hands with various local dignitaries. Julia began her routine: empty the trash can, dust the surfaces, clean the windows, vacuum the carpet. She had done this hundreds of times. She could do it in her sleep. But today, as she emptied the trash can beside the desk, something caught her eye. A folder had fallen behind the trash can, wedged between the can and the wall. It must have been knocked off the desk at some point. Julia bent down to retrieve it, intending to place it back on the desk where it belonged. The folder was unmarked, just a plain manila folder. But as she picked it up, some papers slipped out, falling to the floor. Julia knelt to gather them up, and that was when she saw the header on the first page. Riverside Development Project, Confidential Financial Records. Julia froze. She should put the papers back in the folder. She should place it on the desk. She should finish her work and leave. That was what the invisible cleaning lady would do. But Julia Scott had not always been a cleaning lady, and some instincts, once honed sharp, never fully dulled. Chapter 2. The Woman She Used to Be. 25 years ago, Julia Scott was a name that people knew. Not in Fairbrook, of course. They had never heard of her here. But in newsrooms across the world, in war zones and conflict areas, in the places where history was being written in blood and fire, Julia Scott was legendary. She had started in journalism young, fresh out of Northwestern University, with a degree in journalism and a fire in her belly to change the world. Her first job was at a small paper in Chicago, covering local government. Boring stuff mostly: zoning disputes, budget hearings, the occasional corruption scandal that amounted to nothing. But Julia had a gift. She could see patterns where others saw chaos. She could ask the right questions. She could get people to talk. By the time she was 28, she had broken 3 major stories about city corruption, and the Chicago Tribune had hired her away from the small paper. That was when she got her first international assignment: a civil war in Central America. The paper needed someone to go, and Julia volunteered. Most of her colleagues thought she was crazy. War zones were dangerous. Women journalists especially faced harassment and worse. But Julia went anyway. She was scared during that first assignment. Terrified, actually. The sound of gunfire, the smell of smoke, the sight of buildings reduced to rubble. But she also felt more alive than she ever had behind a desk in Chicago. This was real. This mattered. People needed to know what was happening. She filed her stories from makeshift press centers and bombed out hotels. She interviewed refugees and soldiers, doctors and diplomats. She told the truth, or at least as much of the truth as she could find. And people read her work. They cared. One article led to another assignment. One war zone led to the next. By her mid-30s, Julia was the Tribune's lead foreign correspondent, specializing in conflict zones. She covered wars in the Middle East, Africa, the Balkans. She reported on genocides and humanitarian crises. She won awards. Her byline became synonymous with courage and truth. People often asked her why she did it. Why risk her life for stories? Why go to the most dangerous places on earth? Julia's answer was always the same. Because someone has to witness. Someone has to tell the world what's happening. But there was more to it than that, though Julia rarely admitted it, even to herself. There was an addiction to the adrenaline, to the importance of it all. When you were reporting on war and peace, on life and death, everything else seemed trivial. Normal life seemed colorless and flat. She had relationships that never quite worked out. Men who couldn't understand why she would leave for months at a time, who couldn't handle the anxiety of not knowing if she was safe. She had friends who eventually gave up trying to stay in touch. She had a small apartment in Chicago that she barely used, filled with boxes of unpacked belongings. But she had her work. She had her purpose. And that was enough. Or so she told herself. The year Julia turned 42, she was assigned to cover a conflict in Eastern Europe, a region called Kashovia, where ethnic tensions had exploded into violence. It was a complicated situation, as these things always were. Generations of historical grievances, competing territorial claims, outside powers playing their games, and in the middle of it all, ordinary people just trying to survive. Julia arrived in the capital city in late summer. The city was scarred but still functioning. There was sporadic fighting in some neighborhoods, but most of the intense combat was happening in the rural areas. Julia settled into a hotel that catered to foreign journalists, a place with unreliable electricity and questionable plumbing, but relatively safe. She spent her days reporting, interviewing displaced families, visiting hospitals overwhelmed with wounded, speaking with local politicians who all claimed to want peace, but did nothing to achieve it. At night, she filed her stories and tried to sleep through the distant sounds of artillery. 3 months into her assignment, Julia got a tip. A source told her that a hospital in a town called Dravenka was being used as a cover for military operations. If true, it was a major story. Using civilian infrastructure for military purposes was a war crime, and if Julia could document it, the story would be huge. Her editor was cautious. Dravenka was in a disputed area. The situation was fluid. But Julia had been in dangerous situations before. She knew how to be careful. She hired a local driver named Pavel, an experienced fixer who knew the area. They would go, verify the information, and return before dark. They left early in the morning, driving on roads pockmarked with shell craters. Pavel navigated detours around checkpoints and damaged bridges. The countryside was eerily quiet, abandoned farms and empty villages. The war had swept through like a plague, leaving devastation in its wake. They reached Dravenka by mid-morning. It was a small town, maybe 5,000 people before the war, though it looked mostly deserted now. The hospital was a 3-story concrete building on the edge of town, marked with a large red cross. Julia and Pavel approached carefully. There was no obvious military presence, no vehicles, no soldiers in sight. The hospital looked like just that, a hospital. Maybe the tip was wrong. They entered through the main entrance. The lobby was chaotic. Wounded people on stretchers, overwhelmed doctors and nurses, the smell of blood and antiseptic. It looked like every other hospital Julia had visited in the conflict zone. Julia began asking questions, trying to be discreet. She spoke with patients and staff, looking for any indication of military activity. She saw nothing suspicious. But then, in a corridor on the second floor, she saw something that caught her attention. A door marked, "Storage, authorized personnel only." Something about it felt wrong. The lock was too new, too heavy-duty for a simple storage room. Julia checked that no one was watching and tried the door. It was locked, but the lock was basic. She had learned how to pick simple locks during her years as an investigative reporter. It took her less than a minute. Inside, she found what she had been looking for. Not a storage room, but a makeshift communications center. Radio equipment, maps with military positions marked, ammunition crates stacked in the corner. This hospital was definitely being used for military purposes. Julia began taking photographs with her small camera. This was the evidence she needed. Her heart pounded with that familiar mixture of fear and exhilaration. This story would make a difference. This story would matter. She was so focused on documenting everything that she didn't hear the footsteps in the corridor until it was too late. The door opened and 2 soldiers entered. They wore the uniform of the government forces. They looked young, barely 20, but they carried assault rifles, and their faces were hard. "What are you doing here?" one of them demanded in accented English, his weapon pointed at Julia. Julia raised her hands slowly, keeping her movements calm and non-threatening. She had been in situations like this before. "I'm a journalist," she said clearly. "American journalist. I'm just documenting the situation." "You're not authorized to be here," the soldier said. "I understand. I'll leave right away. No problem." Julia took a step toward the door, but the soldier blocked her path. "You've seen too much," the second soldier said. He looked nervous, which made him more dangerous. For the next hour, Julia was detained in that room while the soldiers argued about what to do with her. They took her camera, destroying her photographs. They searched her, confiscating her notebook and press credentials. They called someone on the radio, presumably a superior, asking for instructions. Julia remained as calm as she could, explaining repeatedly that she was a journalist, that the U.S. Embassy knew she was in the area, that detaining her would create an international incident. Some of it was true. Some of it was bluff. Eventually, a lieutenant arrived. He was older, more professional. He interviewed Julia, asked about her assignment, verified her credentials. Finally, he made a decision. "You will leave immediately," he told her. "You will not publish anything about what you saw here. If you do, there will be consequences." "I'm a journalist," Julia said. "It's my job to report the truth." "The truth?" The lieutenant laughed bitterly. "The truth is that if this hospital stops functioning, 100 people will die. We use this room for communications. That's all. We're trying to coordinate evacuations and medical supplies. But if you publish your story, this hospital becomes a target for the other side. Is that the truth you want to be responsible for?" Julia hesitated. She had not considered that angle. "Go," the lieutenant said, "before I change my mind." They escorted Julia back to where Pavel was waiting with the car. They watched as Julia and Pavel drove away. Neither spoke for the first 10 minutes. Finally, Pavel broke the silence. "That was close, Miss Julia. We should not have come here. I needed to verify the story, Julia said, but her voice was shaky now that the adrenaline was fading. And did you? Verify it? Yes. And now? Will you write the story? Julia stared out the window at the devastated landscape. I don't know. They were halfway back to the capital when they heard the explosions behind them. Heavy artillery from the sound of it. Pavel pulled over, and they both looked back at the horizon. A column of thick black smoke was rising from the direction of Dravenka. Julia felt her heart stop. No, she whispered. No, no, no. Later, she would learn what happened. An opposition force, hearing reports of government military activity in the area, had launched an assault on the town. The hospital had been shelled. 37 people died, including patients, doctors, and nurses. The hospital was destroyed, and Julia knew, with sick certainty, that she was responsible. Someone had seen her at the hospital. Someone had reported the presence of a foreign journalist investigating military use of the facility. That information had reached the opposition forces. They had assumed, not unreasonably, that the hospital was a legitimate military target. Julia had not pulled a trigger or launched a shell, but her investigation, her presence, her pursuit of the truth had led directly to those deaths. She filed her story. She told the truth about the military use of the hospital and about the attack that followed. She did her job, but it felt like blood on her hands. The nightmares started immediately. She would dream of the hospital, of the people she had seen in the lobby that morning, of their faces. She would wake up gasping, covered in sweat, hearing explosions that weren't there. She finished her assignment in Kashovia, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. Back in Chicago, she tried to return to normal. She saw a therapist. She took sleeping pills. She tried to convince herself that she had just been doing her job, that the blame lay with the soldiers who used the hospital and the forces who attacked it. But she couldn't escape the fundamental truth. Her actions had consequences. In her pursuit of the story, she had forgotten that she wasn't just an observer. She was a participant, and participation meant responsibility. 6 months later, Julia Scott resigned from the Chicago Tribune. She told them she needed a break, that she was burned out. They understood. War correspondents burned out all the time. They offered her a leave of absence, but Julia knew she wasn't coming back. She liquidated her meager savings, sold her apartment and most of her possessions. She needed to disappear, to go somewhere nobody knew her name or her face, somewhere she could forget who she had been and what she had done. She found Fairbrook on a map, almost at random. A small town in the Midwest, far from any major city, the kind of place nobody went unless they lived there. Perfect. Julia arrived in Fairbrook in early spring, 22 years ago. She rented a small cottage on Maple Street. She told the landlord she was looking for peace and quiet. That was true enough. She needed work, something simple that didn't require her to think or make decisions or risk anyone's life. The job posting at the municipal building was perfect. Cleaning, invisible work, work that mattered to no one. They hired her without much question. She was overqualified, but she was willing to work hard and didn't ask for much pay. That was enough. For the first year in Fairbrook, Julia barely spoke to anyone beyond necessary pleasantries. She worked, went home, read books, tried to sleep. The nightmares continued. The guilt remained. But slowly, the sharp edges of her trauma began to dull. The people of Fairbrook were kind. They didn't pry. If they wondered about the sad woman who cleaned the municipal building, they kept their curiosity to themselves. Gradually, Julia began to emerge from her shell. She started having coffee at Rosie's diner. She accepted invitations to neighborhood barbecues. She joined the book club. Nobody asked about her past, and Julia didn't volunteer information. She told people she used to work in an office, which was vague enough to be meaningless. She told them she had come to Fairbrook for a quieter life, which was true. That was enough. Years passed. Julia became part of the fabric of Fairbrook. She was reliable, kind, and unremarkable. She made friends in the casual way people in small towns do. She learned everyone's names, their children's names, their stories. She became the person who remembered birthdays and brought soup when someone was sick. But inside, Julia carried her past like a stone. She had buried Julia Scott, the journalist, the woman who chased stories and won awards and believed she was making a difference. She had become Julia Scott, the cleaning lady, invisible and safe. The guilt never entirely left. Sometimes, late at night, she would lie awake and think about those 37 people who died in Dravenka. She had memorized their names from the news reports. She kept their photographs, cut from newspapers, in a box under her bed. Her penance, her reminder, this was what she deserved. A life of service and silence. No more grand ambitions. No more belief that she could change the world. Just quiet work, keeping her head down, hurting no one. For 22 years, that had been enough. But now, kneeling on the floor of Mayor Pierce's office, holding papers that detailed what looked like systematic corruption, Julia felt something she hadn't felt in more than 2 decades. The old instinct. The journalist's instinct. The need to know the truth. Her hands trembled as she looked at the documents more carefully. "Oh, they're nothing special," Martha said, but her face glowed with pride. "Will I see you at book club on Thursday?" "Wouldn't miss it," Julia assured her. She continued down Maple Street, passing the neat rows of houses with their well-kept lawns and white picket fences. Children were heading to school, backpacks bouncing on their shoulders. Dogs barked friendly greetings from behind gates. It was all wonderfully, peacefully ordinary. At the corner of Main Street, Julia stopped at Rosie's Diner, just as she had every weekday morning for the past 22 years. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the warm scent of coffee and fresh pastries embraced her. "There she is," Rosie called from behind the counter. Rosie Martinez had owned the diner for 30 years, and her smile could light up the darkest day. "Your usual table is waiting, honey." Julia remained kneeling on the floor of Mayor Pierce's office, papers spread around her like fallen leaves. Her heart was beating faster than it should, and she recognized the feeling. It was the same sensation she used to get when she was onto something big, when her investigative instincts were screaming that she had found something important. She should put these papers away. She should finish cleaning and leave. This wasn't her business. She was just the cleaning lady. But Julia had spent 25 years as an investigative journalist. She knew how to read documents. She knew what to look for. And these documents were screaming something very wrong. The papers appeared to be financial records related to something called the Riverside Development Project. Fairbrook had been talking about the Riverside development for years. It was supposed to be a major renovation of the waterfront area along the Rock River that ran through the town. New parks, a community center, improved infrastructure. It had been Mayor Pierce's signature project since he was first elected 10 years ago. The project had been controversial from the start. Some people thought it was a waste of money. Others believed it would bring new life to Fairbrook. But Pierce had pushed it through, and construction had been ongoing for the past 5 years. Julia had never paid much attention to it. She wasn't involved in town politics. She voted in elections, but that was about it. She cleaned the municipal building and went home. That was her life. But now, looking at these documents, she saw numbers that didn't make sense. The first page was a contract between the town of Fairbrook and something called Riverside Construction LLC. The contract was for $3.2 million for the first phase of development. That seemed reasonable for a project of that scope. But the next page showed a payment voucher. The town had paid Riverside Construction LLC $4.8 million for the same phase of work, an extra $1.6 million beyond the contracted amount. Julia frowned. Maybe there had been cost overruns? That happened in construction projects. But there should be documentation of change orders, explanations for the additional costs. She shuffled through more papers, more contracts, more payment vouchers, and every single one showed the same pattern. The town was paying far more than the contracted amounts, millions more. And then Julia found a document that made her blood run cold. It was a corporate filing showing the ownership structure of Riverside Construction LLC. The company was registered in Delaware, which was common for businesses seeking privacy. But buried in the paperwork was a list of shareholders. One of them was listed as HP Holdings LLC. Julia knew enough about corporate structures to recognize a shell company when she saw one. HP Holdings. Howard Pierce. The mayor had a financial interest in the company that was receiving millions of dollars in town contracts. That was illegal. That was corruption. Julia's hands were shaking now. She wanted to stop reading, to put everything back and walk away. This wasn't her problem. She had sworn off investigating anything. She had left that life behind. But she couldn't stop. The old instincts were too strong. She kept reading, and the picture became clearer and worse. Over the past 10 years, Fairbrook had paid Riverside Construction LLC more than $22 million for various projects. Schools, roads, the new library wing, park improvements, all legitimate projects that the town needed. But the payments consistently exceeded the contracted amounts by 30 to 40%. That excess money, Julia realized, was going straight into the pockets of Howard Pierce and his partners. $22 million. From a town of 8,000 people. Money that should have gone to improve schools, fix roads, support services for residents. Instead, it had been stolen. Julia sat back on her heels, her mind racing. This was massive. This was the kind of corruption that destroyed small towns. People in Fairbrook struggled to make ends meet. The schools were overcrowded and underfunded. The hospital had been threatening to close. And all the while, the mayor had been systematically looting the town treasury. She heard footsteps in the hallway outside and quickly gathered the papers, stuffing them back into the folder. She shoved the folder behind the trash can where she had found it and grabbed her dust cloth, pretending to be cleaning the desk. The footsteps passed by without stopping. Julia released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She needed to think. She finished cleaning the office mechanically, her mind elsewhere. She emptied the vacuum, wiped down the windows, straightened the chairs. All the while, her thoughts churned. What should she do with this information? The obvious answer was to report it. Go to the police, or maybe the state attorney general. Turn over what she had found and let the authorities handle it. But Julia hesitated. She knew how these things worked. A cleaning lady claiming corruption? Who would believe her? She had no proof. She had seen the documents, but she couldn't very well steal them from the mayor's office. And if she reported what she had seen without proof, Pierce would simply deny everything. He would destroy the evidence, and Julia would be dismissed as a disgruntled employee. She might even be fired or worse. No, if she was going to do something about this, she needed to do it right. She needed evidence, real evidence, documentation that couldn't be denied or destroyed. Julia felt a chill run down her spine. She was thinking like an investigative journalist again. She was thinking about how to document corruption, how to build a case, how to get proof. This was exactly what she had run away from. This kind of work had led to deaths. This kind of investigation could have consequences. People could get hurt. But this was different, wasn't it? This wasn't a war zone. This was a small town in America. The worst that could happen was that Pierce would be angry. He might try to intimidate her. But people wouldn't die. Not like Dravenka. Julia finished cleaning the mayor's office and moved on to the city council chambers. But her mind wasn't on her work. She was making calculations, planning steps. If she was going to do this, she needed to be smart. She needed to document everything carefully. She needed to verify what she had seen. And most importantly, she needed to do it without anyone suspecting. She was the invisible cleaning lady. That was her advantage. Nobody noticed her. She could move through the building unseen. She had access to every office. If she was careful, if she was methodical, she could gather the evidence needed to expose Pierce's corruption. But did she want to? Did she want to step back into that world? Did she want to take that risk? Julia thought about Fairbrook, about her neighbors and friends, about Martha Henderson with her geraniums, about Rosie at the diner, about the young families struggling to make ends meet while their mayor stole from them. They deserved to know the truth. They deserved better. And maybe, Julia thought, this was a chance for something she had never quite achieved. Redemption. Not for the deaths in Dravenka. Nothing could fix that. But maybe she could do something good with the skills she had learned, the instincts she had developed. Maybe she could use her past to help people instead of hurting them. It was a dangerous thought. It was a thought that could lead her back to the life she had fled. But it was also a thought she couldn't ignore. Julia finished her shift and returned to her basement storage room. She put away her cleaning supplies and hung up her uniform. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the wall, at the calendar showing today's date, at the simple routine of her simple life. And then she made her decision. Tomorrow, she would return to the mayor's office, and she would begin to gather evidence. Chapter 4. Gathering Evidence. Julia barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of her cottage, her mind churning through plans and contingencies. Part of her screamed that this was madness, that she should forget what she had seen and go back to her quiet life. But another part of her, a part she had buried for 22 years, was waking up and wouldn't be silenced. By the time dawn broke, Julia had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was careful, methodical. The kind of plan that came from years of investigative work. First, she needed better access to the documents. Looking through papers on the mayor's floor had given her a glimpse, but she needed more. She needed to systematically document the corruption, to understand its full scope. Second, she needed to do it without attracting attention. Her advantage was her invisibility. She was just the cleaning lady. As long as she maintained that cover, she could move freely through the building. Third, and most importantly, she needed to protect herself. If Pierce discovered what she was doing, he could retaliate. She needed to leave no trace, no evidence that could be connected to her. Julia got out of bed and went to her small closet. In the back, behind her clothes, was a cardboard box she hadn't opened in 2 decades. Inside were the remnants of her old life. Her press credentials from the Chicago Tribune, yellowed with age, a few notebooks from her reporting days, and a small digital camera, outdated but still functional. She turned on the camera. The battery was dead. Of course it was. Julia plugged it in to charge, then made herself breakfast. Toast and coffee. She needed to maintain her routine, needed to appear normal. At 7:30, she left her cottage and began her usual walk to town. Martha Henderson waved from her porch. Julia waved back with a smile that felt like it was stretched over her anxiety like plastic wrap. At Rosie's diner, Julia ordered her usual coffee and muffin, but she barely tasted them. Her mind was running through her plan, checking for flaws, preparing for contingencies. "You okay, honey?" Rosie asked, refilling Julia's coffee cup. "You seem distracted." "Just didn't sleep well," Julia said, which was true enough. "Well, drink up. Coffee fixes everything." If only, Julia thought. At the municipal building, she went through her morning routine. First floor public spaces, methodically moving from room to room. But her mind was already on the afternoon, on what she would do when she reached the third floor. The camera was in her cleaning cart, hidden at the bottom under a stack of fresh trash bags. It was fully charged and set to silent mode. No shutter sounds, no flash. Just quick, quiet pictures. Julia had always been good with cameras. In her journalism days, she had learned to document scenes quickly and thoroughly. A few seconds with a camera could capture more than pages of notes. She would need that skill now. At 1 o'clock, Julia took the elevator to the third floor. Her heart was beating fast, but her hands were steady. This was familiar territory, in a way. The nervousness before an investigation, the careful preparation, the knowledge that she was about to cross a line. Mayor Pierce's office was empty, as usual. Julia entered with her cleaning cart, locked the door behind her, and quickly pulled the folder from behind the trash can. She laid the documents out on the mayor's desk and began photographing them methodically. Each page, clearly captured, readable in the frame, the contracts, the payment vouchers, the corporate filings showing Pierce's ownership interest. Every piece of evidence she could find. It took her 15 minutes to photograph everything. 15 minutes where every sound in the hallway made her freeze, where every creak of the building made her heart skip. But nobody came. Julia returned the documents to the folder and replaced it exactly where she had found it. She unlocked the door and resumed her normal cleaning routine. But she wasn't done. Not by a long way. Over the next 2 weeks, Julia systematically gathered evidence. She quickly learned that Pierce was careless with his documents. The man was arrogant, secure in his position, confident that nobody would ever question him. Why would they? He was the mayor. He had been re-elected twice. He was popular. Julia found documents in Pierce's desk drawers, in filing cabinets, even in the recycling bin. Financial records, contracts, emails printed out and annotated. Pierce had kept a paper trail, probably for his own records, never imagining that anyone would see it. She photographed everything. Contract after contract showing inflated costs. Payment records showing money flowing from Fairbrook's accounts to Riverside Construction LLC. Bank statements showing transfers from Riverside to HP Holdings and from there to Pierce's personal accounts. The scope of the corruption was staggering. It went beyond just the Riverside project. For 10 years, Pierce had been funneling money from nearly every town contract to companies he owned or had interests in. Construction projects, maintenance contracts, even the catering for town events. Everything had been rigged to put money in Pierce's pocket. Julia estimated the total theft at somewhere between $25 and $30 million. For a town of 8,000 people, that was devastating. That was money that should have gone to schools, to infrastructure, to services for residents. Instead, it had bought Pierce a mansion on the lake and a luxury car collection. But Julia didn't just photograph financial documents. She also documented the human cost. She started paying attention to council meeting minutes, to budget discussions. She saw how Pierce had repeatedly cut funding for schools, claiming budget shortfalls. She saw how road repairs had been delayed year after year. She saw how the library had nearly closed for lack of funding, all while millions of dollars were being stolen. Julia also began to identify Pierce's partners in the scheme. There were at least 3 other people involved: the town administrator, David Kellerman, the director of public works, Thomas Chu, and a local contractor named Robert Vance, who owned several of the shell companies used to launder the stolen money. These men had worked together to systematically loot Fairbrook, and they had gotten away with it because nobody had thought to question them. Who audits the mayor? Who investigates the people in charge? The invisible cleaning lady, apparently. As Julia gathered evidence, she also had to maintain her normal life. She couldn't afford to act suspiciously. So she went to book club and discussed the latest novel. She had coffee at Rosie's and gossiped about the upcoming harvest festival. She helped Martha Henderson plant her fall flowers, all the while carrying the weight of what she knew. It was exhausting. Julia found herself falling into old patterns. She would wake in the middle of the night with her mind racing, thinking about the evidence, about what she would do with it. She lost weight. Dark circles appeared under her eyes. "Julia, you sure you're okay?" Rosie asked one morning at the diner. "You look tired, honey." "I'm fine," Julia lied. "Just getting older, I guess." "Aren't we all?" Rosie said with a laugh. But her eyes were concerned. Julia knew she needed to be more careful. She couldn't let her investigation consume her. That was what had happened before, in her old life. She had let the story become everything, and people had died. This time would be different. This time, she would stay in control. After 3 weeks, Julia had documented everything she could. She had hundreds of photographs, all stored on the camera's memory card. She had a comprehensive picture of the corruption scheme, how it worked, who was involved, and how much had been stolen. Now she needed to decide what to do with the evidence. The obvious choice was to go to the authorities. But which authorities? The local police chief reported to the mayor. The town attorney was appointed by the mayor. Pierce had systematically installed people loyal to him in every position of power in Fairbrook. Julia could go to the state police or the state attorney general, but she was just a cleaning lady making accusations against a popular mayor. Would they take her seriously? And even if they did, investigations moved slowly. Pierce would have time to destroy evidence, to cover his tracks. No, Julia realized. She needed to make this public. She needed to go to the press. The Fairbrook Gazette was the local newspaper, but it was a small operation, just a weekly publication that mostly covered high school sports and town hall meetings. They didn't have the resources or the expertise to handle a story of this magnitude. But there were larger papers. The state capitol had a daily newspaper with a reputation for investigative journalism. And Julia still had contacts from her old life, reporters who would recognize the story's importance. Except Julia didn't want to be recognized. She didn't want anyone from her past to know where she was or who she had become. The whole point of coming to Fairbrook had been to disappear. Julia sat in her cottage one evening, the camera in her hands, turning it over and over. She was trapped between two worlds, the person she had been and the person she had become, the journalist who believed in exposing the truth and the cleaning lady who just wanted to be left alone. What would publishing this information mean? Pierce would be investigated, probably arrested. The corruption would be exposed. Fairbrook would get its money back, or at least some of it. Justice would be served. But Julia's role would likely be discovered. She would be questioned. Her past might come to light. The quiet life she had built could come crashing down. Was it worth it? Julia looked around her cottage, at the simple furniture she had collected over the years, at the books on her shelves, at the photographs on her wall showing Fairbrook's seasons, the town she had come to love. These people had given her a home when she had nowhere else to go. They had accepted her without asking questions. They had been kind. They deserved better than a corrupt mayor stealing from them. They deserved the truth. Julia took a deep breath and made her decision. She would expose the corruption, but she would do it anonymously. She would send the evidence to the newspapers and to the state attorney general. She would make sure the information couldn't be ignored, but she would keep herself out of it. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best she could do. That night, Julia began preparing her package. She downloaded the photographs from the camera to a laptop she had bought years ago, but rarely used. She organized the images into folders, creating a clear narrative of the corruption. Contracts here, payment records there, corporate filings showing ownership, bank statements showing money flows. She wrote a detailed explanatory document, laying out the scheme in clear terms. She explained how Pierce and his partners had operated, how they had hidden their theft, how much they had stolen. She cited specific examples, pointed to specific documents, made the case that any investigator or journalist could follow. She didn't sign the document. She identified herself only as a concerned citizen of Fairbrook. Nothing that could trace back to her. It took her 3 nights to prepare everything. 3 nights of working at her kitchen table, checking and rechecking, making sure the evidence was clear and comprehensive and damning. Finally, she was ready. Julia bought a prepaid credit card with cash at a convenience store in the next town over. She used a VPN service to hide her internet location. Then she created anonymous email accounts and sent the package to 5 different recipients: the state newspaper, the state attorney general's office, the FBI field office that handled public corruption, and 2 national newspapers that had serious investigative departments. The subject line of each email was simple: evidence of massive corruption in Fairbrook municipal government. Julia hit send and closed the laptop. It was done. Now all she could do was wait. For 3 days after Julia sent the emails, nothing happened. She went through her routine in a state of suspended anxiety. She cleaned the municipal building. She had coffee at Rosie's. She attended a town council meeting, watching Pierce smile and glad hand his constituents, knowing that his world was about to collapse. But she said nothing, did nothing, just waited. On the 4th day, the storm broke. Julia was cleaning the 2nd floor when she heard raised voices from upstairs. She stopped mopping and listened. The sounds were coming from the mayor's office. Pierce was shouting, which was unusual. The man prided himself on his smooth, political demeanor. Julia quietly made her way up the stairs. The door to Pierce's office was open, and she could hear him clearly now. "I don't care what you have to do. Find out where these documents came from." Pierce was yelling into his phone. "Someone had access to my files. Someone's been going through my office." Julia felt her heart skip. Had they discovered something? She had been so careful. She quickly retreated to the 2nd floor before anyone saw her. For the rest of the day, the 3rd floor was chaos. Pierce met with Kellerman and Chu behind closed doors. Police officers came and went. Everyone looked worried and angry. Julia learned what had happened from the gossip that spread through the building. Apparently, the state attorney general's office had contacted Mayor Pierce that morning. They had received evidence of corruption and were opening an investigation. They wanted to interview Pierce and his staff. They wanted access to town financial records. The corruption was being investigated. Julia's package had reached the right people. That evening, Julia sat in her cottage and waited for the news. At 6 o'clock, she turned on her television to the local news station out of the capital. The lead story made her catch her breath. A major corruption scandal is rocking the small town of Fairbrook tonight. State investigators say they've received evidence of systematic theft from the town's treasury, potentially involving millions of dollars. Mayor Howard Pierce, who has led Fairbrook for the past decade, is at the center of the investigation. The report showed footage of the municipal building, of Pierce hurrying to his car while ignoring reporters' questions, of state police vehicles parked outside Town Hall. The state attorney general's office confirmed today that they've received detailed evidence of financial improprieties involving multiple town contracts over the past 10 years. An anonymous source provided documentation showing that Mayor Pierce may have had financial interests in companies that received lucrative town contracts, a clear conflict of interest and potentially criminal behavior. The reporter continued. The FBI has also been notified and is reviewing the evidence. This could be one of the largest public corruption cases in the state's history. Julia watched, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the corruption was being exposed. Dread at what might come next. Over the following days, the story exploded. The state newspaper published a detailed investigative piece based on the evidence Julia had provided. They had verified the documents, traced the money flows, and confirmed the scope of the theft. Their headline read, "Fairbrook's Missing Millions: How a Small-Town Mayor Built an Empire on Theft." National papers picked up the story. Cable news mentioned it. Fairbrook, a town that had never made news beyond local sports scores, was suddenly infamous. The reaction in town was shock and rage. People couldn't believe it. Their mayor? The man who smiled at community events and kissed babies and cut ribbons? A criminal? But the evidence was overwhelming. The documents didn't lie. The financial records were clear. Pierce had stolen millions, and his partners had helped him do it. Julia watched it all from her position of invisibility. She went to work every day at the municipal building, which had become a circus. State investigators set up in the conference rooms. FBI agents interviewed employees. Reporters camped outside, trying to get comments from anyone who would talk. And Pierce? He hired expensive lawyers. He issued statements denying everything, claiming he was the victim of a political witch hunt. But his denials rang hollow. The evidence was too strong. Within a week, the state attorney general filed criminal charges. Mayor Howard Pierce was indicted on 37 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and corruption. David Kellerman and Thomas Chu were also charged. Robert Vance, the contractor, was arrested trying to flee to Canada. Pierce was forced to resign as mayor. The town council appointed an interim mayor. The state took over Fairbrook's finances to conduct a full audit and try to recover stolen funds. The town was in turmoil. People were angry, confused, betrayed. They had trusted Pierce. They had voted for him. How could they have been so blind? Julia listened to these conversations at Rosie's diner, at the grocery store, in the break room at work. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone wanted to know how this had happened, and everyone wanted to know who had exposed it. "Whoever sent that evidence is a hero," Rosie declared one morning at the diner. "They saved this town. Imagine if Pierce had kept going for another 10 years. "But who was it?" Martha Henderson asked. She was sitting at the counter, having her morning tea. "The news keeps saying an anonymous source, but someone had to have access to all those documents." "Maybe someone who works in the mayor's office?" another customer suggested. "I heard it was an accountant who noticed something wrong," someone else said. Julia sipped her coffee and said nothing. The speculation continued for weeks. Everyone had a theory. But nobody suspected the quiet cleaning lady who had worked in the building for 22 years. Julia should have been relieved. Her anonymity was intact. She had done what she set out to do, expose the corruption without revealing herself. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. Because every time someone talked about the hero who exposed Pierce, every time someone said this person deserved recognition and thanks, Julia felt like a fraud. She was hiding again. Hiding her role, hiding her past, hiding herself. And something else was happening too. Julia was starting to remember what it felt like to do meaningful work, to make a difference, to use her skills for something important. For 22 years, she had punished herself with invisibility and silence. She had convinced herself that she didn't deserve to be recognized, that she was better off forgotten. But now, having done something good, something that helped people, she realized how much she had missed that feeling of purpose. She tried to push these thoughts away. This was dangerous thinking. Purpose had led her to Dravenka. Ambition had caused deaths. Better to stay invisible, stay safe. But the thoughts wouldn't go away. A month after the story broke, Julia was at book club. The group was supposed to be discussing a novel, but the conversation kept drifting to the scandal. "I just keep thinking about all that money," said Linda Chen, a librarian. $25 million. Do you know what we could have done with that? The library wouldn't have had to cut hours. We could have hired more staff. We could have updated our technology. The schools lost even more, added Patricia Gomez, a retired teacher. Think of the programs we had to cut, the teachers we had to let go. All because Pierce said there wasn't money in the budget. And all along, he was stealing it. "Someone should write a book about this," Martha said. "The whole story, how it happened, how it was discovered, everything. People need to know the truth." "Who would write it?" Linda asked. "A journalist, maybe," Patricia suggested. "Someone who knows how to tell these stories." Julia's coffee cup rattled slightly as she set it down. The women looked at her. "You okay, Julia?" Martha asked. "Fine," Julia said quickly. "Just thinking about everything that happened." "It's a lot to process," Martha agreed. "But I'm grateful someone had the courage to expose it. Whoever they are." Julia excused herself early from book club that night. She walked home slowly through Fairbrook's quiet streets. The leaves were falling from the trees, autumn deepening into winter. The town looked the same as always, but something fundamental had changed. No, Julia corrected herself. The town hadn't changed. She had. For 22 years, she had been running from her past. She had convinced herself that she needed to hide, that her skills were dangerous, that she was better off invisible. But exposing Pierce's corruption hadn't hurt anyone. It had helped people. It had used her investigative skills, her ability to document and verify and present evidence for good instead of harm. Maybe, Julia thought, maybe she had learned the wrong lesson from Dravenka. Maybe the problem wasn't that she was a journalist. Maybe the problem was that she had forgotten to think about consequences, about responsibility, about the difference between truth and harm. This time, she had been careful. She had thought about consequences. She had documented corruption that needed to be exposed, and nobody had been hurt. In fact, people had been helped. Maybe that was the real lesson. Not that she should never investigate, never seek truth, never use her skills, but that she needed to use them carefully, thoughtfully, with awareness of the impact of her actions. Julia reached her cottage and sat on her porch, looking out at the darkness. Somewhere in that darkness was her camera, with the memory card wiped clean. Somewhere in that darkness was the evidence that had brought down a corrupt mayor. Somewhere in that darkness was the person Julia Scott used to be. And for the first time in 22 years, Julia wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a way to reconcile those two people. The journalist who sought truth and the woman who wanted to live quietly. The investigator with skills and experience, and the person who had learned about consequences and responsibility. Maybe there was a middle path. Maybe she didn't have to choose between all or nothing. But that was a question for another day. Tonight, Julia went inside, locked her door, and tried to sleep. Tomorrow, she would go back to work. Back to cleaning the municipal building. Back to being invisible. For now, that was enough. 3 months after the scandal broke, Life in Fairbrook had begun to return to normal, or at least a new version of normal. Mayor Pierce was awaiting trial, free on bail, but confined to his home. Kellerman and Chu had both pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for testimony against Pierce. Robert Vance was in jail, unable to make bail. The state audit had confirmed the extent of the theft. $27 million over 10 years. The state was working to recover as much as possible, seizing Pierce's assets and going after the money laundered through various shell companies. Fairbrook wouldn't get all of it back, but they would get some. Enough to make a difference. A special election had been held to choose a new mayor. A local businesswoman named Sandra Liu had won in a landslide. Her campaign promise was simple: transparency and accountability. The people of Fairbrook were hungry for both. Julia continued her work at the municipal building. She had received a small raise, which was nice. The building itself had changed. There were new people in key positions, new systems for oversight, new requirements for financial disclosure. The corruption had been a terrible lesson, but Fairbrook was learning from it. Julia should have been content. She had done what she set out to do. The corruption was exposed. Justice was being served. She had remained anonymous. Her quiet life was intact. But she felt restless in a way she hadn't felt in years. One Tuesday morning in early December, Julia was having her usual coffee at Rosie's diner when a young woman entered. Julia noticed her immediately because she was clearly not from Fairbrook. She wore professional clothes, a long coat against the cold, and carried a leather satchel. She looked around the diner with the uncertain air of someone in an unfamiliar place. Rosie greeted her warmly. "Welcome, hun. Seat yourself anywhere." The young woman chose a booth near the window. Julia went back to her coffee and her newspaper, but she noticed Rosie bringing the woman coffee and engaging her in conversation. "You visiting someone in Fairbrook?" Rosie asked in her friendly way. "Actually, I'm here on business," the woman said. "I'm a reporter with the State Tribune. I'm doing a follow-up piece on the corruption scandal." Julia's attention sharpened, though she kept her eyes on her newspaper. "Oh, that whole mess with Mayor Pierce," Rosie said. "We're all still trying to wrap our heads around it. Can I get you some breakfast?" "Just coffee for now, thanks." After Rosie moved away, Julia found herself watching the young reporter. She was probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a professional ponytail. She had pulled out a laptop and was typing notes while glancing around the diner. Julia told herself to mind her own business. The reporter was here to write a follow-up story. That was fine. It had nothing to do with Julia. But old habits died hard. Julia found herself curious. What was the reporter's angle? What was she trying to find out? The reporter spent an hour at the diner, having breakfast and chatting with Rosie and other customers. She asked questions about the impact of the scandal, about how the town was recovering, about people's feelings toward Mayor Pierce, standard follow-up story stuff. Then the reporter did something that made Julia's heart skip. She asked Rosie, "I'm trying to track down the person who originally exposed the corruption, the anonymous source. Do you have any idea who it might have been?" Rosie laughed. "Honey, everyone in this town has been trying to figure that out for months. It's the biggest mystery in Fairbrook. Someone had to have access to the mayor's files, but who? The investigators have been tight-lipped about it." "I've been trying to get information from the Attorney General's office," the reporter said, "but they won't reveal their source. Which I understand, of course. But it's such an important part of the story. Who had the courage to expose this? What motivated them? How did they gather the evidence?" "Wish I could help," Rosie said, "but if I knew, I'd probably have told everyone by now. I'm not good at keeping secrets." The reporter smiled. "Well, if you hear anything, I'd love to know. I'm staying at the Fairbrook Inn for a few days." After the reporter left, Julia sat for a long time, staring into her cold coffee. She should leave it alone. The reporter was just doing her job. Julia's anonymity was safe. Nobody suspected the cleaning lady. But Julia felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The pull of a story. The desire to talk to another journalist, to explain what had happened, to share the truth. She crushed that feeling. It was too dangerous. Talking to the reporter would mean revealing herself. And then what? Her past would come out. People would know who she really was. Her quiet life would be over. No, Julia decided. She would stay silent. That was safer. But over the next 2 days, Julia kept seeing the reporter around town, at the municipal building, interviewing employees, at the library, talking to town council members, at Rosie's diner again, having lunch and chatting with residents. And Julia found herself paying attention to what the reporter was working on. She learned the reporter's name was Maggie Chen. Maggie was writing a long-form piece about the scandal for the Tribune's Sunday magazine section. She wanted to tell the complete story, not just what had been stolen, but how it had been uncovered and what it meant for Fairbrook. Maggie Chen. Julia recognized the name from somewhere. It took her a day to remember, but then it clicked. Linda Chen from book club had mentioned her daughter who worked as a journalist in the capital. Maggie must be Linda's daughter. Julia had met Maggie once, years ago, when the young woman had visited her mother in Fairbrook. Maggie had been fresh out of journalism school then, excited and idealistic, talking about the importance of investigative reporting and holding power accountable. Julia had listened quietly, recognizing her younger self in Maggie's enthusiasm, but she had said nothing about her own past, just smiled and nodded and let the conversation flow around her. Now Maggie was back, a professional reporter working on a major story, and Julia had information that would make that story complete. On the third day of Maggie's visit, Julia made a decision. It was late afternoon, and she had finished her cleaning shift. Instead of going straight home, she walked to the Fairbrook Inn, a small bed and breakfast on the edge of town. She found Maggie in the inn's small dining room, working on her laptop with papers spread across the table. Julia approached slowly, her heart pounding. "Excuse me, are you Maggie Chen?" Maggie looked up, surprised. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" "I'm Julia Scott. I work at the municipal building. I heard you were asking questions about the corruption scandal." Maggie's attention sharpened. "Yes, I am. Please sit down. Would you like some coffee?" Julia sat, feeling like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Your mother is in my book club, Linda Chen." "Oh!" Maggie's face brightened. "Yes, my mom mentioned you. She says you never miss book club." "I try not to," Julia said. She took a breath. "I wanted to talk to you about your story, about the person who exposed the corruption." Maggie leaned forward, suddenly very focused. "Do you know who it was?" "I do," Julia said quietly, "because it was me." The words hung in the air between them. Maggie stared at Julia, her mouth slightly open in shock. "You?" Maggie finally said. "But you're the cleaning lady." "Yes," Julia said. "I am," which meant I had access to places nobody paid attention to. I found documents in Mayor Pierce's office. I photographed them. I sent them to the Attorney General and to newspapers, including yours. Maggie was reaching for her recorder before Julia finished speaking. "Can I record this? This is incredible. How did you—" "No recording," Julia said firmly. "Not yet. Maybe not at all. I need to tell you something first." Maggie reluctantly put the recorder down. "Okay, I'm listening." And so Julia told her story. Not all of it, not at first, just the basics. How she had found the documents, how she had spent weeks gathering evidence, how she had sent it anonymously. "But why?" Maggie asked. "Why did you do it?" Most people would have just looked the other way. Because it was the right thing to do, Julia said simply. This town gave me a home. These people are my friends and neighbors. They deserve to know the truth. But you didn't take credit. You stayed anonymous. Why? Julia hesitated. This was where it got complicated. Because I have a past I'm not proud of. A past I came to Fairbrook to escape. What kind of past? Julia looked out the window at the darkening sky. She had carried this secret for 22 years. Sharing it now felt like opening a door she had kept locked for a very long time. I used to be a journalist, Julia said. A long time ago, before I came to Fairbrook. Maggie's eyes widened. A journalist? What paper? The Chicago Tribune. I was a foreign correspondent. I covered wars and conflicts. I won some awards. I thought I was doing important work. That's amazing, Maggie breathed. But why did you stop? Why are you working as a cleaning lady? Because I made a terrible mistake, Julia said, and her voice cracked slightly. Because people died because of my work. Because I learned that truth-seeking isn't always heroic. Sometimes it has consequences. And then Julia told Maggie about Dravenka, about the hospital and the military equipment, about the investigation that led to an attack, about 37 people who died because Julia Scott had been chasing a story. Maggie listened without interrupting, her journalist's notebook forgotten. When Julia finished, her face was pale. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. I blamed myself, Julia said. Maybe I still do, some of the time. So I ran away. I came here to disappear, to stop being a journalist, to stop causing harm. But you didn't stop, Maggie said softly. You exposed the corruption. You used your skills to help people. This was different, safer. Nobody was going to die because I documented financial fraud. Still, you could have stayed silent. You could have ignored what you found. I tried to, Julia admitted. I spent weeks trying to convince myself to forget about it. But I couldn't. Some instincts are too strong. They sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Maggie spoke. I'd like to tell your story, the full story. Not just about exposing Pierce, but about who you are, about your past and why you did this. It's incredible, Julia. It's a story about redemption and courage and making things right. I don't know, Julia said, fear creeping into her voice. If you publish this, everyone in Fairbrook will know. My quiet life will be over. Maybe, Maggie said, or maybe people will understand. Maybe they'll respect you even more. You've lived here for 2 decades. You're part of this community. They're not going to turn on you because you had a past. I came here to be invisible. And you've been invisible for 22 years. But maybe it's time to stop hiding. Maybe it's time to let people see who you really are. Julia shook her head. I need to think about it. Of course, take all the time you need. Maggie pulled out a business card. This is my cell phone. Call me if you decide you want to talk more. Even if you don't want me to write the story, I'm glad you told me. Your mother talks about you all the time in book club, you know. She's proud of you. Linda doesn't know anything about my past. No, but she knows you're kind. She knows you care about people. She knows you're reliable and thoughtful. That's who you are, Julia. Not just your past, not just your mistakes. All of it together. Julia took the card and left the inn. She walked home through the cold December evening, her mind churning. Maggie wanted to tell her story. And part of Julia wanted that too. Wanted to stop hiding. Wanted to step back into the light. But fear held her back. Fear of judgment. Fear of losing the life she had built. Fear of being known again. Julia spent a sleepless night wrestling with her decision. For 3 days, Julia carried Maggie Chen's business card in her pocket, pulling it out occasionally to stare at it like it might provide answers. She went through her routine mechanically: work, diner, home, while her mind worked through the implications of going public. What would people think? How would they react? Would they see her as a hero, as Maggie suggested, or as a fraud who had been hiding her real identity for decades? On the fourth day, Julia was at work, cleaning the third-floor conference room, when she overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two town council members were in the room. She hadn't realized they were there when she entered. They were discussing the upcoming trial of Mayor Pierce. "The prosecutor says they have an airtight case," one of them said, "all because of those documents someone leaked." "I still can't believe nobody knows who did it," the other replied. "Whoever it was saved this town. We should give them a medal or something. Or a key to the city. Though I guess they don't want recognition, staying anonymous like that. Maybe they're afraid of Pierce retaliating. I wouldn't put it past him." Julia quietly finished her work and left. But the conversation stayed with her. These people wanted to thank the person who exposed the corruption. They wanted to recognize the act, honor it. But how could they when that person remained in shadow? And Julia realized something. By staying anonymous, she wasn't just protecting herself. She was also depriving the people of Fairbrook of the chance to process what had happened, to understand it fully, to move forward together. A story incomplete was a wound that couldn't heal properly. That evening, Julia called Maggie Chen. "I'll do it," she said when Maggie answered. "I'll tell you everything. You can write the story, but I have some conditions." "Of course. What do you need?" "First, I need editorial input. I need to see the story before it's published and have the chance to correct any errors or misunderstandings." "That's reasonable. The Tribune usually doesn't allow sources to review stories before publication, but given the circumstances, I think I can get my editor to agree." "Second, I don't want this to be a puff piece. I'm not a hero. I made terrible mistakes in my past. If you're going to tell my story, tell all of it, the good and the bad." "I will. That's what good journalism does." "And third," Julia paused, "I want to tell the people of Fairbrook myself before the story runs. They deserve to hear it from me first." "How do you want to do that?" "I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out." "Okay. When do you want to start the interviews?" "Tomorrow," Julia said, before she could change her mind. "Come to my house tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock, and bring your recorder. It's time to tell the truth." The next evening, Maggie arrived at Julia's cottage on Maple Street. Julia had made coffee and set out some cookies, though she doubted either of them would eat much. She was too nervous, and Maggie seemed too focused. They sat at Julia's small kitchen table. Maggie set up her recorder and pulled out her notebook. "Ready?" Maggie asked. "As I'll ever be." And so Julia Scott told her story, the whole story, from the beginning. She talked about her early years in journalism, the excitement and idealism of her 20s. She described her rise to become a foreign correspondent, the wars she covered, the stories she broke. She talked about the addiction to adrenaline, to importance, to being where history was happening. She described Dravenka in detail: the hospital, the hidden room, the soldiers, the lieutenant's warning. And then the attack, the deaths, the crushing weight of guilt that followed. Julia's voice was steady, but tears ran down her face as she talked about the 37 people who died. She still kept their names under her bed. She still remembered their faces from the photographs. She explained why she had come to Fairbrook, how she had deliberately chosen invisibility and obscurity, how she had spent 22 years trying to atone for her mistakes by living a small, harmless life. And then she told Maggie about finding the documents in Pierce's office, about the decision to investigate despite her vows never to get involved in anything again, about the weeks of gathering evidence and the final act of sending it to the authorities and newspapers. "Why did you do it?" Maggie asked. "After everything you'd been through, after you'd committed to staying invisible, why take that risk?" Julia thought for a long moment before answering. "Because I realized something," she said slowly. "I had been punishing myself for 22 years. I convinced myself that my skills, my instincts, my training as a journalist, that all of it was dangerous, that I shouldn't use any of it because I might cause harm again. But that wasn't quite right. No, the problem in Dravenka wasn't that I was investigating. The problem was that I didn't think carefully enough about the consequences of my actions. I was so focused on getting the story that I didn't consider what might happen after the story broke. And with Pierce's corruption, I thought about consequences. I thought about who would be hurt and who would be helped. I realized that not exposing the corruption would cause more harm than exposing it. The people of Fairbrook were being stolen from. They deserved to know. So you had learned from your mistake. I had learned to think before acting, to consider impact, not just truth. Truth matters, but so do people. They're not separate things." Maggie was quiet for a moment, writing in her notebook. Then she looked up at Julia. "Do you think you were wrong to leave journalism after Dravenka?" Julia sighed. "I've asked myself that question 1,000 times. I don't know. Maybe I needed to leave. Maybe I needed those 22 years to process what happened, to forgive myself, to learn who I was without the adrenaline and the importance of it all. And now? Now I don't know who I am. I'm not the hotshot war correspondent anymore. But I'm not sure I'm just the invisible cleaning lady either. I'm somewhere in between, still figuring it out. I think," Maggie said carefully, "that you're someone who made a terrible mistake, took responsibility for it, and then found a way to use your skills to help people. That's not nothing, Julia. That's actually pretty remarkable." Julia felt fresh tears on her cheeks. "Thank you." They talked for 3 more hours. Maggie asked about Julia's life in Fairbrook, about her friends and routines, about how she felt about the town. Julia talked about Martha Henderson and Rosie Martinez and book club, about how Fairbrook had given her a home when she needed one. "These people matter to me," Julia said. "That's why I'm so nervous about your story. I don't want them to feel like I deceived them." "Did you deceive them?" "I didn't tell them about my past. I let them think I was just a simple cleaning lady." "But you are a cleaning lady. That's your job. That's what you've done for 2 decades. It's not false. It's just not complete. I hope they see it that way. I think they will. From what I've seen, Fairbrook is full of good people who care about each other. They'll understand." Julia hoped Maggie was right. Over the next week, Maggie conducted more interviews. She talked to people in Fairbrook about Julia, what they thought of her, how they felt about discovering her role in exposing Pierce's corruption. She also verified Julia's past, reaching out to the Chicago Tribune's archives, finding Julia's old articles, confirming the award she had won and the stories she had broken. Maggie even tracked down someone who had known Julia in her reporter days, a former colleague who remembered her as brilliant, driven, and fearless. "But something happened to her," the colleague told Maggie. "Some assignment that went wrong. She just disappeared. We heard she had quit, but nobody knew where she went. Some people thought she might have died. It was like Julia Scott just vanished." "She needed to disappear," Maggie explained. "She was carrying a lot of guilt." "Well, I hope she found some peace. She was one of the best journalists I ever worked with." Maggie also interviewed the state attorney general's office about the case against Pierce. They confirmed that the anonymous evidence had been crucial to the prosecution. Without it, they might never have discovered the extent of the corruption. Whoever provided this information saved the people of Fairbrook millions of dollars, the lead prosecutor said. They should be proud of what they did. Finally, Maggie wrote her story. It took her a week to get it right, going through multiple drafts. She sent each version to Julia for review, taking her comments and suggestions seriously. The final piece was 2,500 words, long for a newspaper story, but appropriate for the Sunday magazine feature it was intended to be. Maggie had titled it, "The Invisible Woman Who Saved Fairbrook: How a Former War Correspondent Turned Cleaning Lady Exposed Small-Town Corruption." Julia read the final draft 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Maggie had told the story honestly and completely. She hadn't shied away from Dravenka or from Julia's guilt and regrets. But she had also captured Julia's redemption, her courage in exposing Pierce despite her fears, her love for the town that had given her refuge. It was, Julia had to admit, a good piece of journalism. Fair, thorough, and humane. "It's perfect," Julia told Maggie. "You can publish it." "Thank you for trusting me with your story," Maggie said. "I know it wasn't easy." "No, but it was necessary." The story was scheduled to run in the Sunday Tribune in 1 week. That gave Julia time to do what she needed to do. She needed to tell the people of Fairbrook herself before they read it in the newspaper. Julia spent 2 days figuring out how to do that. She considered calling a town meeting, but that felt too formal, too staged. She thought about going door to door, but that was impractical. Finally, she decided on a simple approach. She would write a letter explaining everything, and she would post it on the town's community bulletin board at the library. In Fairbrook, everyone checked that board. News spread quickly in a small town. Julia wrote the letter longhand, working late into the night to get the words right. "To the people of Fairbrook, my name is Julia Scott, and I've lived in your town for 22 years. Most of you know me as the woman who cleans the municipal building. Some of you know me from Rosie's Diner or from book club or from various town events. You've been my neighbors and my friends, and this town has been my home. But there are things about me you don't know. Things I've kept hidden because I was afraid and ashamed. Before I came to Fairbrook, I was a different person. I was a journalist, a foreign correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. I covered wars and conflicts around the world. It was important work, and I believed I was making a difference, but I made a terrible mistake. While reporting on a conflict in Eastern Europe, my investigation led to an attack on a hospital. 37 innocent people died. I didn't pull the trigger, but my actions contributed to their deaths. I've carried that guilt ever since. I came to Fairbrook to escape my past, to live a quiet life where I couldn't cause any more harm. You welcomed me without asking questions. You accepted me as simply Julia, the cleaning lady. You gave me a home when I desperately needed one. Several months ago, while cleaning Mayor Pierce's office, I accidentally discovered evidence of corruption. I found documents showing that Pierce had been stealing from the town for years, millions of dollars that should have gone to schools and roads and services for residents. I faced a difficult choice. I had sworn never to get involved in investigations again. But I couldn't ignore what I had found. You deserved to know the truth. So I gathered evidence. I photographed documents. I verified information. And I sent everything anonymously to the state attorney general and to newspapers. I stayed anonymous because I was afraid of losing the quiet life I had built, afraid that if people knew my past, they would judge me, reject me, send me away. But hiding the truth wasn't right. You welcomed me into your community. You deserve to know who I really am. I'm the person who exposed Pierce's corruption. I'm also the person who made terrible mistakes in her past. I'm someone who ran away from her problems and hid for 2 decades. I'm someone who is still learning to forgive herself. I'm all of these things. And I hope, despite everything, that you can accept me. There will be a story in this Sunday's State Tribune magazine about me, written by Maggie Chen. It will tell the full story of who I am and what I did. I wanted you to hear it from me first. I don't expect thanks or recognition. I just hope for understanding. This town saved my life when I arrived here broken and lost. If I've managed to give something back by exposing Pierce's theft, then I'm grateful for that opportunity. Whatever happens next, know that Fairbrook will always be my home, and you will always be my friends. With love and gratitude, Julia Scott. Julia posted the letter on the community bulletin board at the library on Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, everyone in Fairbrook knew. Julia spent the rest of Friday and all of Saturday waiting for the reaction. She stayed home, afraid to face her neighbors, afraid of what they might say. But on Saturday evening, there was a knock on her door. Julia opened it to find Martha Henderson standing on her porch, holding a casserole dish. "Oh, honey," Martha said, tears in her eyes. "Why didn't you tell us?" And then Martha pulled Julia into a hug, and Julia broke down sobbing. Other neighbors arrived over the next hour. Rosie from the diner brought pie. Linda Chen brought flowers. Patricia Gomez brought a bottle of wine. More people came, filling Julia's small cottage with warmth and noise and acceptance. They didn't come to judge her. They came to tell her they understood, that they were grateful, that they still cared about her. "You've been our friend for 22 years, Rosie said firmly. "That doesn't change because we learned you used to be someone else. We love you, Julia. We love you for who you are right now." "All those years you were hiding," Martha added, "and we were just glad to have you as a neighbor. That hasn't changed." Julia cried and laughed and thanked them. She told stories about her past that she had never shared. She answered their questions. She let them see her fully, perhaps for the first time. It was terrifying and liberating all at once. On Sunday morning, Maggie Chen's story ran in the State Tribune. By Sunday afternoon, it had been picked up by several national news outlets. By Sunday evening, Julia Scott's name was trending on social media. The story resonated with people. A war correspondent brought down by guilt and trauma. A woman who spent 2 decades in self-imposed exile. A quiet act of courage that exposed corruption, redemption, and second chances. It hit all the right notes. Julia's phone started ringing with interview requests. News programs wanted her to appear. Publishers wanted to discuss a book deal. Hollywood producers called about film rights. It was overwhelming. Julia had gone from invisible to famous in 48 hours. But Fairbrook protected her. When reporters descended on the town, residents politely but firmly refused to give interviews. When camera crews showed up at Julia's cottage, neighbors formed a friendly barrier, explaining that Miss Scott needed privacy. The interim mayor, Sandra Liu, issued a statement praising Julia's courage while asking media to respect her wishes and the town's need to move forward. Julia herself gave one press conference, held at the town hall. She spoke for 15 minutes, summarizing her story and thanking the people of Fairbrook for their support. She answered a few questions, but then she politely but firmly ended the conference. "I've told my story," she said. "Now I'd like to return to my life." The media attention eventually faded, as it always does. News stories captured the public's imagination. Julia Scott became yesterday's news. But in Fairbrook, things had changed permanently. Julia was no longer invisible. People knew who she was now, knew her full story, and instead of being ostracized, she was embraced even more fully than before. "You're one of us," Rosie told her at the diner. You always have been. Now, we just know more about you. The town council honored Julia at a special meeting, giving her a plaque recognizing her service to Fairbrook. Julia accepted it with grace, but asked that no more fuss be made. I just did what anyone should do, she said. I told the truth. Pierce's trial took place that spring. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The state managed to recover about $12 million of the stolen funds, which were returned to Fairbrook. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to make a significant difference. The new town leadership used the recovered funds wisely. They upgraded schools, fixed roads, improved the library, and invested in community programs. They also implemented new oversight systems to prevent future corruption. Fairbrook began to heal. And Julia began to heal too. 6 months after Maggie Chen's story ran, Julia was still working as a cleaning person at the municipal building. But things were different now. For one thing, people noticed her. Employees who had barely acknowledged her existence for 2 decades now said, "Good morning," asked about her weekend, treated her like a person rather than part of the furniture. At first, the attention made Julia uncomfortable. She had gotten used to being invisible. But gradually, she realized something. Being seen wasn't necessarily bad. In fact, it was rather nice. Julia also discovered that her skills were still valued. The new mayor, Sandra Liu, approached her one day with an unusual request. Julia, I know you're working as cleaning staff, but I wondered if you might be interested in a different position. We need someone to help with transparency initiatives, someone to review our financial procedures, and make sure we have proper oversight. You've proven you understand these systems and that you care about accountability. Julia was surprised. I'm not qualified for that kind of work. I'm not an accountant or... You're a trained investigative journalist with 25 years of experience uncovering corruption and understanding complex systems. You're more qualified than you think. Julia hesitated. I appreciate the offer, but I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of responsibility. No pressure, Sandra said. But think about it. We'd be lucky to have you. Julia did think about it. For several weeks, actually. The idea of stepping back into work that mattered, that used her skills and experience, was both exciting and terrifying. She talked to her therapist about it. After the publicity around her story, Julia had finally sought professional help for her trauma and guilt around Dravenka. It was long overdue, and it was helping. What scares you about taking the job? Her therapist asked. That I'll make another mistake, that I'll hurt people again. But you've already proven you can use your skills responsibly. You exposed Pierce's corruption, and nobody was hurt. In fact, people were helped. That was different. That was a one-time thing. Was it? Or was it proof that you've learned from your past? That you can balance truth-seeking with responsibility? Julia didn't have an answer, but the conversation stayed with her. She also talked to Maggie Chen, who had become a friend since the article. Maggie visited Fairbrook occasionally, partly to see her mother, but also to check on Julia. You should take the job, Maggie said over coffee at Rosie's diner. You're good at this work. You care about it. And Fairbrook needs someone like you. But what if I mess up again? Then you'll fix it. That's what people do, Julia. They try things, they make mistakes, they learn and do better. You're not going to be perfect. Nobody is. But you can be good. You can make a difference. I made a terrible difference in Dravenka. Yes, you did. And you've been punishing yourself for it for over 20 years. At some point, you have to decide. Are you going to let that one mistake define you forever? Or are you going to let it be part of your story? A terrible part, yes, but not the only part. Julia stirred her coffee, thinking. I'm afraid I've forgotten how to be that person. the journalist who believed she could change things. I don't think you've forgotten. I think you've just been hiding it. But it's still there. I saw it when you talked about exposing Pierce. Your eyes lit up. You were alive in a way I hadn't seen before. Julia knew Maggie was right. As terrifying as it had been, gathering evidence and building the case against Pierce had made her feel purposeful in a way she hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was time to stop hiding, not just from others, but from herself. Julia told Sandra Liu she would take the job, but with conditions. She would start part-time, working 3 days a week. She would focus on developing transparency protocols and reviewing financial procedures, not on active investigations, and she wanted the flexibility to step back if she found it wasn't working. Sandra agreed to all of Julia's conditions. Julia's first day in her new role was strange. She walked into the municipal building wearing office clothes instead of her cleaning uniform. She took the elevator to the second floor, where she had a small office with a desk and a computer. Gary, the security guard, did a double take when he saw her. "Ms. Scott, you look different." "New job," Julia said with a smile. "But I'm still me." Her work was challenging, but satisfying. Julia reviewed the town's financial procedures and identified dozens of weaknesses that had allowed Pierce's corruption to flourish. She developed new protocols for contract oversight, financial disclosure, and budget transparency. She attended town council meetings and explained her recommendations. She worked with the new town administrator to implement reforms. She trained staff on the importance of accountability and oversight. It wasn't journalism, exactly, but it was investigative work. It required the same skills: attention to detail, ability to spot patterns, asking the right questions, and it mattered. Julia was helping to ensure that what happened with Pierce could never happen again. People in Fairbrook appreciated her work. They saw her not as the tragic figure from Maggie's article, but as a valued member of the community using her skills to help everyone. Julia still had her dark moments. Nights when she couldn't sleep, when the memories of Dravenka haunted her. Days when the guilt felt overwhelming. But they became less frequent. Therapy helped. Purpose helped. Community helped. She began to understand that she would always carry Dravenka with her. Those 37 deaths would always be part of her story. But they didn't have to be the only part. She could acknowledge her mistake, learn from it, and still move forward. She could do good work in spite of her past, or perhaps because of it. One evening, Julia was having dinner at Rosie's diner when a young woman approached her table. She was in her early 20s, with bright eyes and an eager expression. "Excuse me, are you Julia Scott?" "Yes," Julia said cautiously. She still wasn't entirely comfortable with being recognized. "I'm Emily Tran. I'm a student at State University. I'm studying journalism." "Oh?" "I read about you, about your career and what you did here in Fairbrook. You're kind of a legend in journalism school." Julia almost laughed. "I don't know about that." "You are, though. We study your articles from your Tribune days. Your coverage of the Balkans conflict won a Pulitzer, didn't it?" "It was nominated. It didn't win. Still, it was amazing work. And then what you did here." "I'm writing my thesis about investigative journalism and public accountability. I was wondering if I could interview you." Julia's instinct was to say no. She had given one interview to Maggie and had decided that was enough. She wanted to move forward, not keep reliving the past. But looking at Emily's eager face, she remembered being that young, that excited about journalism, that convinced that reporting mattered. "Okay," Julia said. "I'll talk to you. But you should know, I'm going to tell you about the mistakes too, not just the successes." "That's exactly what I want to hear," Emily said. "Because that's real journalism, isn't it? Not just the glory, but the responsibility." "Yes," Julia said softly. That's exactly what it is. They met the following week at Julia's cottage. Emily brought her recorder and her questions. Julia made coffee and opened up in a way she was still learning to do. She told Emily about her career, but she focused on the lessons. The importance of thinking through consequences. The need to balance truth-seeking with responsibility. The reality that journalism, like any powerful tool, could do harm as well as good. So you think journalists should second-guess themselves? Emily asked. I think journalists should think. Really think. About what they're reporting, why they're reporting it, who will be impacted, what the consequences might be. That doesn't mean censoring important stories. It means being thoughtful and responsible. But don't people have a right to know the truth? Yes. But truth exists in context. The truth about the military equipment in that hospital in Dravenka was accurate, but broadcasting it had consequences I didn't consider. The truth about Pierce's corruption was also accurate, and broadcasting it had positive consequences. The difference was thinking through the impact. How do you know which is which? You don't always. But you can ask the right questions. Who will this story help? Who might it hurt? Is there a way to tell it that minimizes harm while still serving the public interest? Are there alternatives I haven't considered? Emily nodded, taking notes furiously. This is really helpful, thank you. After Emily left, Julia sat on her porch and watched the sun set over Fairbrook. The town was quiet in that gentle way of small places as evening settled in. Lights came on in houses. A dog barked somewhere down the street. The church bells chimed 7 o'clock. Julia thought about the girl she had been, fresh out of journalism school, so certain that reporting was about chasing truth no matter the cost. She thought about the woman she had become after Dravenka, broken and convinced her skills were dangerous. And she thought about who she was now, still learning, still growing, still trying to find the balance between truth and responsibility. She wasn't the same person she had been at 25 or even at 42. But maybe that was okay. Maybe we're all works in progress, always learning, always trying to do better. Her phone rang. It was Maggie Chen. Hey, Julia, I wanted to give you a heads up. The Tribune is doing a follow-up piece on the Fairbrook scandal. It's been a year since the story broke, and they want to check in on how the town is recovering. My editor wants to include a sidebar about you and your new position. Do I have to be interviewed again? No, if you don't want to. I can write it from what I already know, but I thought I'd ask. Julia considered. A year ago, she would have said no immediately. But now? Okay, she said. One interview. But make it clear I'm not looking for publicity. I'm just doing my job. Got it. Thank you, Julia. The follow-up piece ran a month later. It was titled, Fairbrook, 1 year after the scandal. The article detailed how the town had recovered, the returned funds, the new leadership, the improved oversight systems. It mentioned Julia's new role, but briefly and respectfully, focusing more on the town's overall progress. The article concluded, Fairbrook's story is ultimately one of resilience and redemption. A town was looted by its own leadership, but saved by an unlikely hero. A cleaning lady with a hidden past and a commitment to truth. Today, Fairbrook is healing, its future brighter than its recent past. And Julia Scott, the woman who exposed the corruption, continues to serve the town she loves, no longer invisible, but finally, fully, home. Julia read the article at Rosie's diner over her morning coffee. When she finished, she found Rosie standing by her booth with a smile. Nice article, Rosie said. It's okay, Julia said modestly. Honey, you need to accept that you did something amazing, not just exposing Pierce, though that was huge, but showing that it's never too late to do the right thing. That people can change, can grow, can become who they're meant to be. I'm not sure I'm who I'm meant to be yet. Still figuring that out. Well, whoever you're becoming, we're glad you're doing it here. Your family, Julia. You always have been. Julia felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you, Rosie. As she left the diner, Martha Henderson called to her from across the street. Julia, book club tonight? Don't forget. I won't, Julia promised. Book club. Such a simple thing. A group of women gathering to discuss novels, drink wine, and talk about their lives. But it represented everything Julia had been running from, and everything she had found in Fairbrook community: belonging. Home. That evening, Julia walked to book club at Linda Chen's house. The same women who had been meeting for years, plus a few newer members. They discussed the month's selection, argued about character motivations, debated the ending. And at one point, Martha said, "You know, this book reminds me of Julia's story. The main character is running from her past, trying to hide who she really is. But she can't escape it. She has to confront it to move forward." Is that how you felt, Julia? Patricia asked. Like you were running? Julia thought about it. Yes, I was running. For a long time. But eventually, you get tired of running. Eventually, you realize you have to turn around and face whatever you're running from. And when you do, Linda asked, then you can finally stop running. You can stand still. You can maybe even move forward. The women nodded thoughtfully. The conversation moved on to other topics. Someone's grandchild, someone's garden, plans for the upcoming holidays. Normal life. Beautiful, ordinary, normal life. Julia participated fully, no longer holding herself apart. She laughed at jokes, she shared her opinions, she made plans with friends, she was present, fully present. For the first time in 22 years. Walking home after book club, Julia looked up at the stars. They were bright tonight, visible in a way they never were in big cities. She had forgotten how many stars there were. She thought about trajectory, about how a single decision could change the entire course of a life. Her decision to investigate the hospital in Dravenka had brought her low. Her decision to expose Pierce's corruption had begun to lift her back up. What would her next decision be? Where would her path lead now? Julia didn't know, but for the first time in a long time she was curious to find out. Not afraid, not resigned, just curious. Maybe that was progress, maybe that was healing, or maybe, Julia thought with a small smile, maybe it was just life. Messy, complicated, beautiful life. She reached her cottage and paused at the door, key in hand. Inside was her home. Outside was her community. Around her was the town that had saved her, and that she, in turn, had saved. Julia Scott was no longer invisible. She was seen, known, accepted. All of her, the mistakes and the triumphs, the past and the present, the person she had been and the person she was becoming. It was terrifying. It was liberating. It was real. And it was enough. Julia opened her door and went inside, closing it gently behind her. Tomorrow she would go back to work at the municipal building. She would review more procedures, suggest more reforms, help build a better system of accountability. She would have coffee at Rosie's and chat with neighbors. She would live her life, not a life of invisibility and hiding, not a life of glory and recognition, just a life, a good life, a life that mattered. And that, Julia realized as she prepared for bed, was all she had ever really wanted. 5 years later. The Fairbrook Town Square was decorated with bunting and balloons. A small stage had been set up near the fountain, and folding chairs filled the square. It was a perfect spring day, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming flowers. Julia Scott stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as Mayor Sandra Liu took the stage. This was the 5th anniversary celebration of Pierce's conviction, but more importantly, it was a celebration of Fairbrook's recovery and renewal. 5 years ago, Sandra began, our town faced a crisis. We discovered that the people we trusted to lead us had betrayed that trust. Millions of dollars were stolen. Our schools suffered. Our infrastructure crumbled. Our faith in government was shattered. The crowd was silent, remembering. But we didn't give up. We came together. We demanded accountability. We elected new leadership. We implemented reforms. And we rebuilt. Sandra gestured to the people around the square. Today, our schools are fully funded and thriving. Our roads are fixed. Our library has been expanded. Our community center offers programs for residents of all ages. We've even been able to lower property taxes while improving services. There was applause. None of this would have been possible without the courage of one person who decided that truth mattered more than personal safety, who decided that this community deserved better, who decided to speak up even though it meant risk. Julia felt people looking at her. She kept her eyes on the stage, uncomfortable with the attention as always. Julia Scott doesn't want recognition, Sandra continued. She's told me that repeatedly. But on this anniversary, I think it's important to acknowledge what she did and what it meant. Not to make her uncomfortable, sorry, Julia, but because her story is part of our story. Her courage is part of our recovery. More applause. Julia felt her cheeks getting warm. But this celebration isn't just about the past. It's about the future. We've learned important lessons from what happened. We've learned that transparency matters, that oversight matters, that ordinary citizens have the power and the responsibility to hold their leaders accountable. Sandra smiled. And speaking of the future, I'm pleased to announce that Julia Scott has agreed to serve as Fairbrook's first Director of Civic Accountability. In this new full-time position, she'll oversee our financial procedures, coordinate with state oversight agencies, and help other small towns develop their own accountability systems. Julia's jaw dropped. She and Sandra had discussed this possibility, but Julia hadn't committed to it yet. And Sandra hadn't mentioned she was going to announce it publicly. Sandra caught her eye and grinned mischievously. I'm sorry for springing this on you, Julia, but I figured you'd keep saying you needed to think about it. Sometimes you need a little push. The crowd laughed. Julia shook her head but couldn't help smiling. Sandra knew her too well. After the speeches ended, people came up to Julia to congratulate her. She accepted their good wishes graciously, more comfortable with recognition now than she had been 5 years ago, though still not entirely at ease with it. Maggie Chen was there, having driven in from the capital for the event. She hugged Julia warmly. Director of Civic Accountability, that's quite a title. I haven't officially accepted yet, Julia protested weakly. But you will. You know you will. This is what you're meant to do, Julia. I don't know about meant to do, but it's work I care about. That's the same thing. Later, after the crowd had dispersed and Julia was helping to fold up chairs, a car pulled up to the square. A woman got out, maybe 50 years old, well-dressed and professional-looking. Excuse me, are you Julia Scott? Julia straightened up, wary. Yes? My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm the mayor of Hillcrest, a town about 60 miles from here. I wondered if I could talk to you about your work. What kind of work? Accountability systems, oversight procedures. We've been reading about what Fairbrook has done, and we're interested in implementing similar systems. Our town council hasn't done anything as bad as your former mayor, but we've had some smaller issues. We want to get ahead of any problems before they become crises. Julia felt a familiar spark of interest. That's smart. Preventive oversight is much easier than dealing with corruption after the fact. Exactly. So I was wondering, would you be willing to consult with us? We'd pay for your time, of course. We just need someone with experience to help us set up proper systems. Julia glanced around. Sandra was nearby, watching with a knowing smile. I think I could do that, Julia said, as long as it doesn't interfere with my work here in Fairbrook. I'm sure we can work out a schedule. Thank you so much. This means a lot. After Rebecca left, Sandra walked over to Julia. See? Other towns need what you have to offer. I'm not sure I have that much to offer. Julia, you've spent the past 5 years becoming an expert in government accountability. You've developed systems that work. You've helped train our staff. You've even testified at the state legislature about the need for better oversight of small-town governments. You have enormous value to offer. It's not journalism, though, Julia said quietly. It's not what I used to do. No, it's better. Because you're not just reporting on problems, you're helping to solve them. You're preventing corruption before it happens. That's at least as important as exposing it after the fact. Julia considered that. Sandra was right. This work was different from her old journalism career, but it was equally meaningful, maybe more so. Okay, Julia said. I'll officially accept the director position, and I'll help Hillcrest and any other towns that want assistance. Good, because I already set up a meeting with 3 other mayors who are interested in consulting with you. You're very presumptuous. I prefer to think of it as confident in your abilities. That evening, Julia had dinner at Rosie's diner with her usual group of friends: Martha, Linda, Patricia, Rosie, and a few others. They had claimed the large booth in the back, and the conversation flowed as freely as the wine Rosie kept pouring. To Julia, Martha said, raising her glass, our local hero. I'm not a hero, Julia protested, as she always did. You are, Linda insisted. You saved our town, and now you're going to help other towns. That's heroic. I just did what needed to be done. Which is exactly what heroes say, Patricia added with a laugh. They talked late into the evening, about town gossip and national politics, about books and movies, and their various aches and pains as they all got older. Normal conversation among friends. At one point, Linda said to Julia, You know, when you first came to Fairbrook, you were so sad, so closed off. I remember thinking, that poor woman, she's carrying something heavy. I was, Julia admitted. But you're different now, lighter, happier. I think I've finally forgiven myself, or at least started to. For what? Martha asked. Julia had told her friends about Dravenka years ago, after Maggie's article came out. They knew about her past, her mistakes, her guilt. For being human, Julia said. For making mistakes. For not being perfect. None of us are perfect, Rosie said. We're all just doing our best. That's what my therapist says. Smart therapist. As Julia walked home that night, she thought about how far she had come. Not just physically, from war zones around the world to a small town in the Midwest, but emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. She had spent so many years running, hiding, punishing herself. She had convinced herself that she didn't deserve happiness or purpose or recognition, that she should live small and quiet and invisible as penance for her mistakes. But she had learned something important. You can't atone for mistakes by making yourself small. You atone by learning, growing, and using your experience to do better, to help others, to make the world a little bit better than you found it. Julia had made terrible mistakes. The deaths in Dravenka would always haunt her. But she had also done good work. She had exposed corruption. She had helped develop systems to prevent future abuses. She was helping other towns protect themselves. That didn't erase her mistakes, but it balanced them. It gave meaning to her suffering. Julia reached her cottage and paused at the gate, looking back toward the town square. 5 years ago, she had been terrified of being exposed. Now she was standing in the light, doing work that mattered, surrounded by people who knew her and valued her. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself as a young journalist chasing stories around the world, but it was a good life, an honest life, a meaningful life, and that was enough, more than enough. Julia went inside, made herself a cup of tea, and sat at her kitchen table. She pulled out her laptop and began drafting an outline for the accountability system she would propose to the mayor of Hillcrest. There was work to do, important work, and Julia Scott was ready to do it. Not as the invisible cleaning lady, not as the war correspondent who had made terrible mistakes, but as Julia Scott, Director of Civic Accountability, friend, neighbor, and citizen of Fairbrook. All of her. The whole complicated, flawed, courageous human person she was. Finally, fully herself. And outside her window, the stars shone bright over Fairbrook, a town that had been broken and healed, a community that had faced darkness and chosen light, a place where second chances were real and redemption was possible. For Julia Scott, and for anyone brave enough to seek it, it was real. And it was enough. Julia opened her door and went inside, closing it gently behind her. Tomorrow she would go back to work at the municipal building. She would review more procedures, suggest more reforms, help build a better system of accountability. She would have coffee at Rosie's and chat with neighbors. She would live her life. Not a life of invisibility and hiding, not a life of glory and recognition, just a life, a good life, a life that mattered. And that, Julia realized as she prepared for bed, was all she had ever really wanted. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.